She couldn't see his face, but she felt his hatred the moment he opened his mouth. A blind black woman, 74 years old, walking the same path she had walked for 19 years. A hand-carved hickory cane made by a man she had loved for 41 years and buried 6 years before this morning. A uniformed officer who had broken people before and walked away clean every single time. He thought she was the easiest target he would ever find. He had no idea who raised her son. He had no idea what that son had spent 18 years building case by case, courtroom by courtroom, in the halls of the United States Department of Justice. One act of cruelty, one broken heirloom, one reckoning that would reach the governor's desk. This is that story. There is something about early morning in Harlan's Creek, Georgia, that belongs only to the people who wake early enough to claim it. Before the traffic thickens on Calder Street, before the smell of exhaust replaces the smell of honeysuckle, before the world remembers to be complicated. In those first quiet minutes after dawn, the town breathes differently, slower, more honest. Dorothy Weston had been claiming that morning silence for 19 years. Every day at 6:10 she rose from the same chair she had sat in since the house was hers alone, laced her shoes the same way she always had buttoned her coat, with the patience of someone who had long since stopped measuring time in hurry and reached for the cane that hung beside her front door on a hook Eugene had put there himself. She could not see the hook. She could not see the coat or the shoes or the pale morning light coming through the window. Dorothy Weston had been blind since she was 52 years old, the result of an accident on the highway outside of Macon that took her sight in a matter of seconds and left her with a choice she made quietly, without much ceremony, while still in the hospital. She was going to keep walking, not metaphorically, literally. The doctors had told her that with the right training with a cane and patience and the kind of spatial memory she already had from years of moving through this house, through this neighborhood, through this town, she would be able to navigate the world she had always lived in. It took her 14 months to feel sure of herself on the sidewalk. Another 6 to stop counting her steps out loud. But she learned. And the route she chose down Calder Street across Monroe Bridge, through the southern edge of Riverside Park to the bench under the old water oak and back, became as natural to her as breathing. 74 years old, blind for 22 of them, walking the same path 7,000 times or more. She did not walk for exercise. She walked because walking was the thing that reminded her she was still here, still upright, still refusing to shrink into the corners of a house and wait for life to finish with her. Dorothy had survived things that would have quieted most people permanently. She had marched in Savannah in 1973, 15 years old and terrified, but walking forward anyway because her mother was beside her, and her mother did not know how to turn around. She had buried a daughter at 3 months old in 1978. And come home from the hospital and made dinner because there was another child who needed to eat. She had worked 31 years as a bookkeeper for a construction company in Harlan's Creek, doing the work of 2 people for the salary of 1, and never once been given the title that matched the job. She had held Eugene's hand in the hospice room at Grady Memorial and whispered the same prayer she had whispered every night of their marriage, and when he stopped breathing, she had finished the prayer before she allowed herself to cry. That was Dorothy Weston. The cane she carried was not just a cane. Eugene had made it himself 8 months before he died, when her old one had cracked, and she had not told him because she did not want him worrying about something so small when he had so much else pressing on him. He found out anyway. He always found out. He had spent 3 weekends in the garage working on a piece of straight-grained hickory he had sourced from a lumber yard in Macon, shaping it by hand, sanding it until the surface was smooth as river stone. He had carved their initials near the base small and close together the way they had always been. D and E inside a small oval, the kind of thing you would only see if you were looking for it. She had held that cane the day of his funeral. She held it now every morning, and in the weight of it, she still felt his hands. That Tuesday in late October, Dorothy stepped off the porch of her green house on Calder Street at 6:12 2 minutes later than usual because she had stopped to rebutton her coat from the top. The air was cool, sharp, the kind of autumn morning that smells like dying leaves and something permanent underneath them. She turned left at the end of her walk, felt the familiar slope of the sidewalk under her feet, heard the traffic on the cross street 2 blocks ahead, and began to move. She was not thinking about danger. She never thought about danger on this walk. This was the one part of her day that belonged entirely to her. 3 miles away, at 6:07 that same morning, Officer Dale Pruitt pulled his department cruiser out of the lot behind the Harlan's Creek Police Department and turned onto the main commercial strip with no particular destination and every particular attitude. Pruitt was 38 years old. He had been on the force for 11 years. He was a large man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a jaw set permanently at a slight forward angle, as if he were always bracing for an argument he intended to win. His mirrored sunglasses were already on, though the sun had barely cleared the tree line. He wore them not for the light. He wore them so people could not see where his eyes were pointed. In 11 years, Dale Pruitt had accumulated 9 internal complaints. 9 documented, filed, submitted through the proper channels complaints from residents of Harlan's Creek who had felt the wrong end of his judgment. 7 of those 9 involved Black or Latino residents. 6 of the 7 were elderly. Every single complaint had been dismissed, not for lack of evidence, not because the complaints were obviously false, but because the Patrolmen's Brotherhood, the local union chapter that represented every officer on the force, had a full-time attorney whose only job was to ensure that complaints like these vanished into administrative review and never emerged as discipline. Pruitt knew this. He had always known this. The knowledge sat in him the way a certain kind of confidence sits in a man who has tested a fence and found it does not hold, and has been walking through it ever since. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Raymond Osler, had tried twice to move Pruitt out of Riverside Park Patrol. Both times, Gary Vollmer, the Brotherhood chapter president, and a man who had held that position for 13 years through a combination of loyalty, politics, and personal favors, had made a phone call, and both times Pruitt had stayed. Osler had put the last attempt in writing. The memo sat in a file at the precinct with no action stamp on it. Just a date and a signature and the quiet record of a system that protected men like Pruitt, not because it believed in them, but because it had decided at some institutional level that the cost of removing them was higher than the cost of keeping them. What that calculation did not account for was Dorothy Weston, or her son. Pruitt turned his cruiser onto the service road that ran along the western edge of Riverside Park and slowed to a crawl. This was his preferred morning route. He told himself it was about visibility, about presence, about making sure the park was orderly. What it was actually about was the feeling he got from knowing that in this particular stretch of road, in this particular neighborhood, he was the highest authority present. He saw her from 40 yards away, an elderly black woman alone, moving slowly on the path with a cane. He watched for a moment. Then he pulled the cruiser to a stop, got out, and walked toward her. Dorothy heard the boots before she heard anything else. That was one of the things no one understood about living without sight. You hear everything differently. You hear the weight of a person in their footsteps. The mood of them, the intention. These boots were deliberate, heavy. The sound of someone who wanted to be heard coming. She paused and tilted her head slightly, a habit from years of orienting herself through sound. Her cane tapped forward once and then held still. The voice, when it came, was clipped and flat. "You lost, ma'am." It was not a question. It was not a greeting. It was the verbal equivalent of a hand pressed flat against a door. Dorothy turned slightly toward the sound. "Just walking," she said, "same as I do every morning." He asked if she was out here alone. The question had the shape of concern, but none of the warmth. It was an accusation wearing a costume. She told him she knew this park the way she knew her own kitchen, that she had walked this path nearly every day for 19 years, that she was perfectly fine. He let out a short, sharp laugh. Not the kind that meant something was funny, the kind that meant he had already decided she was wrong about herself. "Well, that might be part of the problem," he said. She did not respond to that. She knew men like this, had known them her whole life. Men who mistook silence for submission and politeness for weakness. Men who could not stand the presence of a black woman who was not afraid of them. She had been not afraid of men like this since 1973. She was not going to start now. She said she would be on her way and began to move forward. He stepped closer. Too close. Into the space that in any honest reading of the situation had not been offered to him. "You should let me take a look at that," he said. And before she could answer, before she could process what he meant, or pull back, or speak, or do anything at all, his hand closed around her cane. The shock of it was physical. She had not been touched without her permission in longer than she could remember. Not grabbed, not seized. And certainly not like this from a stranger in a uniform without warning, without reason in the open morning air of a park she had walked 7,000 times. Her fingers resisted. The grip between her palm and the hickory was 19 years deep. Bone memory. Muscle memory, the kind of hold that does not loosen easily. But he pulled harder. The cane slipped, and then came the sound. Crack. A clean, brutal, deliberate snap. The sound of hickory breaking is not like the sound of something falling. It is sharp, definitive. It has a quality of finality that ordinary breakage does not have. Dorothy stood completely still. Her balance shifted, and her free hand reached into the air searching for something that was not there. The ground felt suddenly uncertain beneath her. The world which she navigated through sound and memory, and the steady contact of that cane with the pavement, had just become unreliable in a way that she had not felt since the first months of her blindness. The broken halves hit the pavement. She heard them land. He said something then. His voice was low and contemptuous, the voice of a man who had said similar things to similar people and never once been made to account for it. He told her that next time she should not get smart. He told her some folks might not be as patient as he was. And then his boots crunched on the gravel, moving away, unhurried, as if nothing of consequence had happened. Dorothy did not move, not for 30 full seconds. She stood in the middle of the path in Riverside Park in the pale morning light she could not see under a sky too clear and too blue for something this cruel to have happened in it. And she simply stood. The sound of him leaving, the sound of his cruiser door, the sound of the engine, and then the sound of morning returning birds and wind and the distant traffic on the bridge, indifferent and continuous, the world going on as if nothing had happened. Because to most of it nothing had. She could hear people nearby, the hush of a jogger slowing to look, the murmur of 2 women who had been sitting on a bench and had gone quiet. No one spoke to her. No one came forward. No one asked if she was all right. The silence of bystanders is its own kind of violence, and Dorothy Weston had lived long enough to know that. She did not blame them, not entirely. She understood the calculus of fear, but she felt the absence of their voices like a second wound. She knelt slowly, one hand braced against her knee, and felt along the pavement until her fingers found the first half of the cane, then the second. She held them together for a moment, the two pieces of what Eugene had made for her, the wood that still held the faint trace of oil from his hands, even after all these years. Then she stood. She turned in the direction of home, and she walked, no cane to guide her. One palm tracing the brick railing of Monroe Bridge as she crossed it, the other hand out slightly feeling the air, reading the slight changes in temperature and sound that told her where the curb was, where the turn was, where the door was, step by step. 19 years of memory carrying her where her eyes could not. When she got home, she sat down at the kitchen table and placed the two halves of the cane in front of her, wrapped them in a dish towel. The way you wrap something that cannot be repaired, but that you are not ready to let go of. She sat beside them and waited for the shaking to stop. Calvin Obie was 22 years old, and he had been working the parking lot attendant booth at the east entrance of Riverside Park for 7 months. He had not meant to record it. He had looked up from his coffee when he heard the cruiser pull in the way you look up when something official enters your field of vision and your body makes the quiet decision to pay attention. He had watched Pruitt walk toward the woman on the path, and something in the way Pruitt moved the width of the stride, the set of the shoulders, the particular forward-leaning quality of a man who had already decided how the next 5 minutes would go, made Calvin reach for his phone before he consciously chose to. He pressed record. He kept the phone low. He was 22 and black, and he understood with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had grown up in a city with a police force like this one, exactly what could happen to a young man who openly filmed an officer who was in the middle of doing something wrong. The footage was shaky, shot from 40 feet away through the windshield of his booth, but it was clear enough. You could see the approach. You could see Pruitt reach for the cane. You could see the struggle. You could hear in the audio that crack. You could see Pruitt drop the pieces at her feet. You could see him walk away. You could see Dorothy standing there alone, the whole world moving around her and not one person going to her. Calvin sat in his booth for 20 minutes after Pruitt left. He watched the video 3 times. Each time he watched it, the feeling in his chest got heavier. He had not intervened. He had pressed record instead of walking over. And he would carry that specific regret for a long time, the knowledge that recording something is not the same as stopping it, and that sometimes you choose one when you should have chosen the other. But he had the footage, and he knew the way you know certain things before you know why you know them, that this video mattered. That it was not just 47 seconds of his morning. It was evidence. It was something that the system, which had dismissed 9 complaints about this man, could not dismiss if it was placed in front of the right people. He drove to Dorothy's house on his lunch break. He knocked. When she answered, he introduced himself. She did not know him. He told her he had been in the booth, that he had seen everything, and that he had something she needed to hear. She let him in. He sat at her kitchen table across from the dish towel with the broken cane inside it, and he played the video. She listened. Every word. Every moment. The distant sound of the crack captured in a phone microphone from 40 feet still unmistakable. When it ended, she sat quietly for a long time. Calvin said he was sorry. He said it the way young people sometimes say things they mean deeply, but cannot find adequate words for. She told him it was not his fault, and she meant it. Then, after a silence long enough to be its own kind of language, she said, "But it is someone's." She told him she needed to think. She told him not to send the video to anyone. Not yet. She asked him to come back in the morning. He said he would. He left. And Dorothy Weston sat in her kitchen with the broken cane and the weight of a decision she already knew she was going to make. She just needed one night to prepare herself for what it would cost. By noon the next day, the neighborhood knew, not from a news story, not from a social media post, from the way news has always traveled in communities like this one, through the church phone tree that connected 63 households on the south side of Harlan's Creek, through the conversation between two women at the hair salon on Calder, who had a cousin who had seen it happen, through the particular expression on the face of the man at the gas station, who had been in the park that morning and had not said anything, and was now carrying that silence the way you carry something too heavy to put down. By 2 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Raymond Osler had received a call from a civilian who had heard about the incident secondhand and wanted to know what the department intended to do. Osler called Pruitt in. Pruitt told him it was a wellness check. He said the woman seemed disoriented, unsteady, that he was concerned she might fall. He said the cane had been accidentally dislodged during the interaction. Osler looked at Pruitt and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked, "Did you file an incident report?" Pruitt said he had. Osler looked at the report when Pruitt left the room. It was 4 sentences. Wellness check, female pedestrian, Riverside Park, no incident. 4 sentences. Dorothy Weston's name was not in them. The cane was not in them. Physical contact was not mentioned. Osler had been a lieutenant for 12 years. He knew a lie shaped like a report when he read one. He also knew what would happen if he pushed this without footage, without a formal complaint, without something that could survive contact with Gary Vollmer and the Brotherhood's legal apparatus. He had tried before. He knew how it ended. He placed the report in the file. He did not close the file. But he did not have enough yet to open it all the way. That evening, 3 women from Dorothy's church came to her house on Calder Street. They brought food, a pot of something warm, cornbread, a container of sweet tea. They sat in her living room and they did not ask her to talk about what had happened if she did not want to. They just sat. In their tradition, sitting with someone is the highest form of witness. It means, we are here. You are not alone in this. We will not make you explain it for our comfort. Dorothy sat with them for an hour. She appreciated the silence more than she could say. But she was thinking about something she had not yet done. She had not called Marcus. She had been turning this over since the morning. Marcus was 46 years old and lived in Washington, D.C., and had a life there that was serious and important and busy, in ways she was proud of but did not always fully understand. She did not like to pull him toward trouble. She had spent most of his childhood trying to keep trouble away from him, not summon him back to it. But she also knew what Calvin's video was. She knew what it meant in the hands of someone who knew what to do with it. And she knew that her son, whatever else he was, knew exactly what to do with it. She made the call at 9:47 that evening. She sat in her chair by the window, the dish towel with the cane beside her, and she called the number she had memorized 30 years ago and never had to look up. He answered on the second ring. She told him what happened. She did not embellish. She did not allow her voice to break. She told him in sequence with the precision of a woman who had worked with numbers and facts her whole life. The time, the location, the approach, the words, the cane, the sound, the walk home. When she finished, the line was quiet. 4 seconds. She counted them. Marcus had stood in federal courtrooms during the reading of guilty verdicts and not let his face move. She had seen him do it once years ago when she had sat in the gallery for one of his cases. His stillness in those moments was not coldness. It was control. The practiced discipline of a man who had learned that his face in professional settings belonged to the case, not to himself. But she could hear something in those 4 seconds that she had not heard in his voice since he was a boy. He asked 3 questions. Was she hurt? Was there any record of the cane anywhere? Did anyone else know what had happened? She said no, and not yet except Calvin. He told her he was getting on the first flight out of Reagan National in the morning. He told her he was bringing someone with him. He told her to lock the front door, get some rest, and not to worry. She told him she had never worried a day in her life. He said, "I know, Ma, I know." After she hung up, she sat for a while longer in the dark house on Calder Street, the dish towel and its broken contents on the table beside her. She was not afraid. She was not even angry exactly, or not just angry. What she felt was something older and more specific than anger. The particular weight of being a black woman in the South who has done everything right, who has walked carefully and spoken politely, and given no reason at all, and still been reached for. She had felt this weight before. She had set it down every morning by walking out her front door and moving through the world anyway. She set it down now by going to bed. Tomorrow, the weight would be carried somewhere else. You have to understand who Marcus Weston was before you can understand what happened next. Not the version of him that would walk into a hearing room in Harlan's Creek with a manila folder and a quiet certainty that made lawyers nervous. The version of him that started. He was born in that green house on Calder Street 46 years ago, the second child of Eugene and Dorothy Weston. His father worked the assembly line at a parts manufacturer on the east side of town. Honest and relentless work, the kind that builds a man's shoulders and then takes them back by the time he reaches 50. His mother kept the books for a construction company and kept the family together with the kind of organizational precision that would have made her an executive in a different world. Marcus was not the loudest boy in his class. He was the most observant. He noticed things. The way certain teachers looked at certain students. The way certain calls from his father's job took longer than others. The way certain police cruisers drove slowly past certain houses on certain streets. He started asking questions about what he noticed when he was 9. His mother told him to write them down, so he did. He filled 3 notebooks by the time he was 13. He got a full scholarship to the University of Georgia at 17, law school at Georgetown at 21. 7 years as a federal public defender in Atlanta, where he learned the machinery of the system from the inside, where he saw what it looked like when that machinery worked against the people it was supposed to protect. And then at 35, he joined the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the unit that prosecutes law enforcement officers for constitutional violations, for excessive force, for false arrest, for the abuse of authority under color of law. He had handled 31 such cases in 11 years. He had secured convictions in 24 of them. He had been named to the Attorney General's honor roll twice. He was a senior trial attorney. He did not wear his credentials publicly. He did not carry them into rooms like a calling card. He brought them like a quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it does not need to. When people who knew him were asked to describe him, they tended to use the same word. The last person a corrupt officer wanted across from them in a hearing room was a man who was deliberate, who had been deliberate for 18 years, who had built every one of his 24 convictions not on passion, not on spectacle, but on the slow, deliberate accumulation of documented, irrefutable fact. He landed in Atlanta at 7:15 in the morning. He drove to Harlan's Creek. He walked through his mother's front door before 9. He did not speak first. He sat down beside her at the kitchen table. He looked at the dish towel with the broken cane inside it for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and Dorothy, who had not cried since the incident, felt something shift very slightly in her chest, the way things shift when the person you have been trying to be strong for is finally in the room. She did not cry, but it shifted. Calvin came back that morning as he had promised. Marcus reviewed the footage 4 times on a laptop he had brought from Washington. He took notes in a yellow legal pad, the same kind he had used since law school. He wrote down the exact timestamp, the direction of approach, the badge number visible in the video at 1.214, the specific moment of the break frame by frame. He asked Calvin questions with the precision of a man taking an official statement, because that was in effect what he was doing. Calvin answered everything. His account was consistent. His memory of the morning was detailed and specific in the way that things are when they have been turning over in your mind every waking moment since they happened. Marcus made one phone call when they were done, to Special Agent Lorraine Webb of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. He had worked with Webb on 2 prior joint investigations, one in Savannah and one in Augusta. She was methodical, unintimidated, and had a reputation in the GBI for following evidence wherever it led without stopping to check whether the destination was politically convenient. He told her what had happened. He sent her 3 frames from the video. He asked her if she had anything on Officer Dale Pruitt badge 214 Harlan's Creek PD. She called him back in 20 minutes. She had a flag. A GBI flag from 2021 connected to an incomplete internal investigation that had been closed by the department before the GBI could finish its own review. The complaint was from a 68-year-old black man named Clarence Mosby, a retired postal worker whose walking stick had been confiscated by Pruitt during a park encounter and returned to him damaged. The complaint had been submitted, investigated internally, closed in 11 days. Mosby had not pursued it further. He had not believed it would matter. Webb said she was on her way to Harlan's Creek. She arrived at Dorothy's house at noon. The 4 of them sat at the kitchen table, Dorothy, Marcus, Webb, and Calvin. Webb opened her file. She laid out what the GBI had been building quietly on the periphery of a department they did not have jurisdiction over, but had been watching. 9 internal complaints, 7 involving Black or Latino residents. 6 of the 7 elderly, all 9 dismissed. The 2021 flag on Mosby, and now Dorothy, plus the video. Marcus laid his legal pad flat on the table. He drew a straight line across the bottom and wrote 2 words beneath it. Pattern established. He looked at Webb. She nodded. This was not one incident. This was what you got when a system protected a predator for long enough. When every complaint was absorbed and neutralized. When every victim was left to believe their experience was isolated individual not worth pursuing because it had never once been worth anything before. What the system had not counted on was the 47th second of Calvin's footage, and the woman sitting across the table from a federal attorney who happened to be her son. Within 48 hours, Webb had identified 2 additional prior victims. The first was Gloria Reyes, 61, a Latina grandmother who had been walking her dog through Riverside Park in the spring of the previous year, when Pruitt had pulled up beside her, demanded she explain what she was doing in the area, and threatened her with a citation for trespassing on public property when she did not answer quickly enough. She had not filed a complaint. She had been afraid. She had gone home and told her daughter, and her daughter had told her the same thing every daughter tells a frightened mother in that situation: just stay out of his way. The second was Patricia Drummond, 59, a black schoolteacher who had been stopped in her car 6 months earlier in a neighborhood 2 blocks from the park. Pruitt had demanded she prove she belonged in the neighborhood. She had called her school on speaker, had a colleague confirm her employment and address, and been allowed to go. She had not filed a complaint either. She had been afraid of exactly this, that it would go nowhere, and that the act of reporting would make things worse. Both women agreed to speak to Webb. Both women had been holding their stories in private for months, and both of them, when they heard about Dorothy Weston, felt the specific and complicated relief of a person who discovers that what happened to them was not in their imagination, was not their fault, and was not, after all, invisible to the world. Marcus filed the formal federal civil rights complaint on day 3. It named Officer Dale Pruitt. It cited specific dates, times, and incidents. It named Dorothy Weston as the primary complainant. It referenced the 2021 GBI flag and the accounts of Mosby, Reyes, and Drummond. It cited 18 United States Code Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. It was submitted to the Civilian Oversight Board of Harlan's Creek with a simultaneous notification to the DOJ Civil Rights Division Field Office in Atlanta. The complaint triggered a mandatory hearing under Georgia statute. The board had 10 business days. That same afternoon, Chief Norman Barr of the Harlan's Creek Police Department held a press conference on the steps of the department. He stood behind a podium in his dress uniform. He spoke slowly. He used the word unfortunate. He used the phrase good faith wellness check. He said Pruitt had been placed on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of the board's review. He said the department took all allegations of officer misconduct seriously. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the cane. He did not say Dorothy Weston's name. Marcus watched the press conference on his phone in Dorothy's kitchen. He made one note on his legal pad. Union language, no admission. Exactly the playbook. The following morning, the Harlan's Creek Courier ran the story. By afternoon, it had been picked up by 2 Atlanta News affiliates. By evening, a national civil rights wire service had filed a brief. The story was out. And in Harlan's Creek, something that had been underground for a long time began to rise. Clarence Mosby saw the news coverage on the television in his living room and sat very still for a full minute. Then he picked up the phone and called the GBI tip line. He told the woman who answered that he had a complaint from 2021 that had been closed without resolution, that it involved Officer Dale Pruitt, and that he would like to speak to someone about reopening it. He was transferred to Agent Webb within the hour. Gloria Reyes saw the coverage on her daughter's phone and did not say anything for a while. Then she told her daughter she needed to make a call. She contacted the local NAACP chapter. The chapter director connected her to Marcus by the end of the day. Patricia Drummond sent a direct message to the email address listed in the Courier article. Marcus's office confirmed receipt within 24 hours, and one by one, quietly without fanfare, the stories that had been swallowed by silence began to surface. Not just Mosby and Reyes and Drummond, a retired minister who had been followed through the park by Pruitt for 2 full circuits before Pruitt finally drove away. A 64-year-old black woman who had been told by Pruitt that she could not sit on a certain bench, that it was reserved for local residents in a public park with no such policy. 2 elderly black men who had been approached and questioned while playing chess at a table near the fountain, both asked for identification, neither given a reason. None of them had filed complaints. All of them had the same reason when asked what was the point. What was the point when every complaint went into a file, and every file went into a drawer, and every drawer was locked by a union, whose only interest was in keeping its members employed? Marcus documented each account. Webb verified what could be verified, and the picture that emerged was not a rogue officer having bad days. It was a man who had treated a specific stretch of a public park as his private kingdom, who had decided over years of unchecked impunity that certain people in that park were there at his discretion, who had never once been made to feel the weight of a consequence. The filing grew thicker, And in the evenings, quietly without anyone organizing it formally, neighbors began to gather outside Dorothy's house on Calder Street. Not a protest, not with signs or chants, just people, standing, being present. Some of them left flowers on the porch. One man left a jar of honey with a note attached. A woman from the church brought a new scarf. Dorothy heard them through the window. She did not go out, but she pressed her hand flat against the window frame and felt the vibration of that many voices, that much collective presence moving through the glass. The night before the hearing, Marcus sat on the porch until nearly 1 in the morning. Dorothy came out at 11:30. She sat in the rocking chair she had kept on that porch since Eugene was alive. The chair made the same small sound it always had, the soft complaint of old wood against the boards. They did not talk at first. The night was clear. The temperature had dropped and the stars were sharp above the streetlights. Marcus told her what was going to happen the next day. Procedurally, who would be in the room, what order the testimony would follow, what the board had the authority to do, what would happen after. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she rocked once more and asked her question. "Will he be in the room?" Marcus said yes. She nodded, sat for a moment. Then she said she wanted to testify. He told her she did not have to, that the evidence they had assembled was already more than sufficient to support every count in the complaint, that she had already done the hardest part by being willing to be named. She let him finish. Then she said sufficient was never what you taught yourself to settle for, and you learned that from watching me. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." She went inside at 2 in the morning. He sat for another hour, thinking about 31 cases, about the ones that had gone well and the ones that had not, about the specific quality of these cases, the use of force cases, the ones where the person being harmed was the person the system had decided it did not need to protect, about what it had cost those people, not just the incident itself, the reporting, the waiting, the being asked to tell the story again and again to people who held pens and clipboards, and the power to decide whether the story was true enough to matter, about what it had cost his mother to walk home from that park without her cane. He went inside at 3. At 5 in the morning, he heard her moving in her room, getting dressed. At 5:15, she was already in the kitchen. When he came downstairs at 5:30, she was sitting at the table, coat button, shoes laced, the cloth bag with the broken cane in her lap. She had been ready for hours. The Civilian Oversight Board of Harlan's Creek met in the second-floor chamber of City Hall. It was a high-ceilinged room with tall windows on the south wall and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above a long rectangular table where the 7 board members sat facing the room. The chair was Evelyn Cross, a former federal magistrate judge who had retired to Harlan's Creek 12 years ago and had chaired the board for 9 of them. She was in her late 60s, white-haired and deliberate, and she had a reputation for running proceedings without sentiment, but with an absolute commitment to procedural correctness that made even seasoned attorneys careful about how they spoke in her room. The chamber was nearly full when the hearing began at 9 in the morning. Journalists from the Courier and both Atlanta affiliates sat in the designated press section. Clarence Mosby was there in a brown suit he had ironed the night before. Gloria Reyes sat beside her daughter. Patricia Drummond was in the 3rd row, the retired minister, the 2 men who had been playing chess, neighbors from Calder Street, members of Dorothy's church, people who had come because they needed to see this happen. Officer Dale Pruitt arrived with his union attorney, Gerald Fitch, a heavy-set man with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular confidence of someone who had been walking into rooms like this for 20 years and walking out without damage. Pruitt wore a gray suit. He sat with his hands flat on the table. He looked straight ahead. He had been in a complaint proceeding 4 times before. All 4 times he had sat the same way. Waited. Watched it end. Gone home. He glanced across the room when Marcus entered. A man in a dark suit. No lapel pin. No federal insignia visible. Carrying a manila folder and a legal pad. Pruitt looked at him the way he had looked at every complainant attorney who had ever sat across from him in a proceeding like this. He did not see anything that worried him. He had no idea. Agent Webb sat beside Marcus. Dorothy sat in the front row of the public gallery, the cloth bag in her lap, her back straight, her face forward. Chair Cross called the hearing to order at 9:03. She established the record this was a formal proceeding of the Harlan's Creek Civilian Oversight Board, conducted pursuant to Georgia Code reviewing the complaint filed against Officer Dale Pruitt, badge number 214, concerning an incident at Riverside Park on the morning of October 19th. She noted that the record of this proceeding would be simultaneously submitted to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division for independent review. Fitch's expression shifted slightly at that last part. He wrote something on his notepad. Cross nodded to Webb. Webb presented the evidentiary package. She began with the video. The chamber was quiet when it played on the screen mounted to the wall. 47 seconds. Shaky footage from 40 feet away through a windshield on a cool October morning. You could see Dorothy on the path. You could see Pruitt's approach. You could hear in the room's silence every word of the exchange. You could see the moment his hand closed on the cane. You could see the struggle, and then the crack, loud even through a phone speaker. Loud enough that 2 people in the gallery drew a short breath. The silence after it on the recording was the silence of a woman standing alone. Webb let the video play through. Then she presented the evidentiary file. The 9 internal complaints, each one dated, named, and described. The outcome noted beside each one dismissed. The 2021 GBI flag on the Mosby incident. The accounts of Reyes, Drummond, Mosby. The pattern analysis Webb had compiled showing date, location, and demographic profile of each documented encounter over 6 years. Then she placed Pruitt's own incident report on the screen. 4 sentences. Wellness check. Female pedestrian, Riverside Park, no incident. She let the board read it. Then she placed the video screenshot beside it. Dorothy on the path. Pruitt's hand on the cane. No incident. Board member Harold Tate, a former county prosecutor, leaned forward and asked Pruitt directly, "Did you file this report?" Pruitt said yes. Tate asked, "Does this report mention any physical contact with the complainant?" Pruitt said he did not believe physical contact was material to the wellness check. Tate looked at the video screenshot. He said nothing for a moment. Then he wrote something down. Fitch attempted to reframe. He said his client had conducted a good-faith welfare check on an elderly woman walking alone without an apparent companion. He said the cane had been inadvertently dislodged during the interaction. He said the damage to the mobility aid was accidental, and his client deeply regretted any distress caused. Chair Cross looked at Fitch over her glasses. She asked if the encounter was a routine wellness check, and the contact was accidental. Why does the filed report contain no mention of contact, no mention of the complainant's name, no mention of the mobility aid, and no description of any of the events depicted in that video? Fitch began to answer. Cross held up one hand. A small, precise gesture, the kind that means I was not asking you a question I needed you to answer. She turned to Marcus. She said, "Counselor, you filed the federal complaint. Please state for the record your professional relationship to the complainant and your credentials as they are relevant to these proceedings." Marcus stood. He said, "My name is Marcus Weston. Dorothy Weston is my mother. I am also a senior trial attorney with the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. I have held that position for 11 years. I have handled 31 use-of-force investigations involving law enforcement officers. I have secured federal convictions in 24 of those cases." The room was not loud when he said this. It was the opposite of loud. It went the specific quiet of a space in which something important has just been understood. Journalists typed. Board members leaned forward. Fitch's pen stopped, and Dale Pruitt, for the first time since he had sat down in that room, looked directly at Marcus Weston. Something moved across his face. Not immediately. It took 3 full seconds. The way it takes 3 full seconds for a man to understand that the ground he has been standing on for 11 years is not solid, has never been solid, has been held up only by the willingness of other people to pretend it was, and that pretending has just ended. He looked at Fitch. Fitch was looking at the table. Pruitt looked back at Marcus. Marcus was not looking at him. Marcus was making a note. Cross said, "Please continue, Mr. Weston." Marcus did. He told the board that the case before them was not in the language of the complaint filed by Gerald Fitch's client, a wellness check gone wrong due to miscommunication. He asked permission to replay 12 seconds of the footage. Cross granted it. He played the specific 12 seconds in which Pruitt's hands close around the cane and pull. Not accidentally, not reactively, deliberately, with the full-bodied commitment of a person making a choice. He said, "This is not miscommunication, this is a decision." He said the incident report filed by Officer Pruitt contains no mention of this decision, because Officer Pruitt understood at the time that what he was doing could not be accurately described in a report he would have to defend. He said, "We are asking this board to find that what is documented in this video, combined with the pattern of behavior documented in the complaint file, constitutes a deliberate and repeated abuse of authority under color of law, and to forward this record to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review." He sat down. Fitch had 4 minutes of response. He used 3. Then Chair Cross said the complainant herself has asked to address the board. "I am allowing it." She nodded to the front row. Dorothy was escorted to the witness chair. She moved carefully, her hand on Marcus's arm until she reached the seat. She set the cloth bag on the table in front of her, opened it, placed the 2 halves of the broken cane on the table side by side. She let the board look at them. Then she said, "I am not going to tell you again what happened that morning. The video tells it better than I can. What I am going to tell you is what that cane was." She told them about Eugene, about the 3 weekends in the garage, about the hickory and the sanding and the initials at the base, about the weight of it in her hand, 19 years of mornings, the way it had never once let her fall. She said, "He did not break a piece of wood. He broke something my husband's hands built, and he did it because he believed from the first moment he walked toward me that there would never be a room like this one." She turned her face toward the part of the room where Pruitt was sitting. She could not see him, but she faced him directly. "The way you face something you are not afraid of." She said, "I am not here because I am angry. I have been angry at men like him before, and anger alone does not change rooms. I am here because 11 people filed complaints before me, and none of those complaints brought anyone to this table. And I decided that I would be the one who did." She folded her hands on the table. The 2 halves of the cane lay in front of her, the carved initials facing up. She said, "I am 74 years old. I have been blind for 22 years. I have walked that park 7,000 times without asking for help or permission or anyone's approval. All I have ever wanted is to keep walking." The room was very still. Chair Cross thanked her. Dorothy picked up both halves of the cane, returned them to the cloth bag, and walked back to her seat. Without assistance, without hesitation. Pruitt did not speak for the rest of the hearing. The board recessed at 11:40. While they were out, the chamber held its breath in the particular way that rooms hold their breath when something inevitable is approaching. Fitch leaned toward Pruitt and spoke quietly. Pruitt stared at the table. He did not respond. In the gallery, Clarence Mosby sat with his hands folded. Gloria Reyes held her daughter's hand. Patricia Drummond looked at the cloth bag in Dorothy's lap. Marcus sat perfectly still. Legal pad closed, hands flat, eyes forward. The board returned at 12:20. Chair Cross read the findings into the record. The board found that the evidence submitted was clear, documented, and credible. The board found that the video, the prior complaint record, and the false incident report together established a pattern of targeted harassment of elderly residents of color in Riverside Park. The board found that Officer Dale Pruitt had used physical force against a civilian without legal justification, had destroyed a mobility aid, and had filed a false official report to conceal those actions. The board voted on the motion to recommend termination of Officer Dale Pruitt's employment 6-1. On the motion to refer the case to the Harlan's Creek District Attorney's Office for criminal review, unanimous. On the motion to forward the full record to the DOJ Civil Rights Division, unanimous. The gavel came down. In the gallery, someone exhaled, then someone else. The sound moved through the room slowly, like something being released. Mosby pressed his mouth flat and looked at the ceiling. Reyes put her hand over her face. Drummond closed her eyes. Dorothy sat with her back straight and her hands folded and her chin level. She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply breathed. Pruitt stood and walked out. His boots were the same boots that had crunched on gravel in Riverside Park 3 weeks earlier. But the sound they made now was different. Every camera in the room tracked him across the floor. He did not look at anyone. He walked to Fitch's car in the parking lot. The image of that walk ran on every news broadcast that evening. Criminal charges were filed 8 weeks after the hearing. 3 counts: assault under color of law, criminal destruction of property, specifically a medical mobility device, filing a false official report. Each count was documented with evidence that had been building for 11 years and had been consolidated into this case in 11 days. Clarence Mosby's 2021 complaint was reopened. 2 additional counts were added to the indictment. Unlawful detention. The Patrolmen's Brotherhood announced through a statement from Gary Vollmer that Officer Pruitt's legal defense was a personal matter, and that the Brotherhood's resources would not be directed toward criminal proceedings. Gerald Fitch withdrew. Pruitt was represented at arraignment by a public defender. It was the first time in his career that the union had not stood behind one of its members, and in the weeks that followed, the Brotherhood itself fractured slightly quietly in the way institutions fracture when the thing they have been protecting finally becomes undeniable in public. 3 chapter members publicly distanced themselves from Vollmer's handling of the prior complaints. 2 longtime Brotherhood members called for an internal review of how the 9 complaints against Pruitt had been managed. The fracture was small, but it was there, and small fractures in old institutions have a way of spreading. Chief Norman Barr resigned 6 weeks after the hearing before a separate board inquiry into his role in suppressing the prior complaints could be completed. He cited personal reasons and a desire to spend time with his family. His pension was under review. The DOJ Civil Rights Division opened a formal pattern or practice investigation into the Harlan's Creek Police Department. Agent Webb coordinated the inquiry. The investigation documented 43 unjustified stops in Riverside Park over a 5-year period. 38 of them involved Black or Latino residents over the age of 55. The report recommended a federal consent decree requiring mandatory body cameras, independent review of all civilian complaints, and regular third-party audits of patrol patterns. 7 months after the hearing, Dale Pruitt pleaded guilty to 2 of the 3 criminal counts. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal custody. His law enforcement certification in the state of Georgia was permanently revoked. He would not work in a uniform again. Not in this state. Not with these hands. 6 weeks after the hearing, Dorothy Weston walked out her front door at 6:10 in the morning. In her hand was a new cane, straight-grained oak, made by a woodworker from her church who had spent 2 weekends getting it right. He had asked her what kind of grip she preferred. He had asked about the height. He had asked what wood she wanted. She had told him hickory if he had it oak, if he did not. He had oak. He had shaped it carefully and brought it to her house on a Sunday, and stood in her kitchen while she held it for the first time, feeling the balance, the weight, the fit of it in her palm. It felt different from Eugene's cane. Of course it did. Nothing would ever feel the same as that. But it felt right, firm and steady. The kind of thing built by careful hands that wanted to get it right. She turned left off the porch, down Calder Street. The temperature was cool, that same late autumn bite in the air. She moved at her pace, the cane tapping its familiar rhythm. The trees along the sidewalk still bare from the season. When she reached Monroe Bridge, she crossed it. The same bridge she had crossed 10,000 times. She kept her hand near the rail, as she always did, not because she needed it, but because she liked the feel of the stone under her palm. She entered Riverside Park from the south. The path was the same path, same gravel, same curve around to the bench. When she reached the spot where it had happened, she stopped. She stood for a moment. Then she tapped the ground once with the new cane. Once. Firmly. The way you acknowledge something without letting it become bigger than it is. And she kept walking. Not because it didn't matter. It mattered enormously. It would matter for the rest of her life. But stopping is not what she was built to do. She had never once stopped. And she was not going to start today. Marcus returned to Washington the week after the hearing. He did not give interviews about himself. He declined 3 speaking invitations from organizations that wanted him to come and talk about the case. He accepted one from a law school in Georgia because the audience was students, and students needed to hear that these cases were possible and what they required. He requested a temporary reassignment to the DOJ's Atlanta field office for the duration of the federal investigation. That way he could drive to Harlan's Creek on Sundays. He sat on Dorothy's porch. They drank tea. They did not always talk. Sometimes she told him about her walk that morning, what the park smelled like, whether the chess players were back at the table by the fountain, whether the bakery on Calder had something good in the window. He listened. He kept one photograph in his phone. He had taken it the morning after the hearing at the kitchen table before Dorothy had put the cloth bag away. The 2 halves of the cane laid side by side on the dish towel, the carved initials facing up, the D and the E inside the small oval. It was his lock screen, not as a trophy, as a reminder, because the cases that mattered most in his 18 years of doing this work were not the ones with the most media attention or the heaviest sentences. They were the ones where the person who had been wronged had never expected anyone to fight for them, had never believed the system would turn and face them, had walked home alone in the dark with their hands out because the thing that was supposed to carry them had been taken. Those were the cases. Those were always the cases. If you believe stories like this one matter, if you believe that the truth of them should be heard, we invite you to subscribe our channel and help these voices reach further. In Harlan's Creek, the path through Riverside Park is unchanged. The gravel is the same gravel. The bench is still under the old water oak. The fountain still runs in the center of the square. What changed is smaller than the park and more permanent than the path. The Civilian Oversight Board now has subpoena power. Every officer on the Harlan's Creek force wears a body camera. Footage is submitted for independent review within 72 hours of any civilian complaint. Complaints are no longer reviewed by the same department receiving them. A third-party attorney conducts the initial intake. None of this undoes what Dale Pruitt did. None of it gives Dorothy back the hickory cane or the wood that Eugene's hands shaped. None of it returns the 11 people who filed complaints before her to the mornings they were taken from. But the park is quieter now. Quieter in the right way. The way mornings are supposed to be before the weight of the world remembers to be complicated. And when people cross Monroe Bridge in the early morning, when they nod to each other in the pale light before the traffic thickens and the day begins, there's something in that nod that was not there before. The knowledge that this time, when something broke in public, someone made sure it did not stay broken. That the woman who walked home alone without her cane walked back into that park 6 weeks later. That she tapped the ground once at the place where it happened, and kept going. She hadn't expected anyone to come. That was the thing Dorothy kept returning to in the days after the hearing. Not the verdict. Not the board's unanimous vote to refer the case for criminal review. Not the sound of the gavel, or the look on Fitch's face, or the image of Pruitt walking across the parking lot toward a car that was no longer heading toward anything good. What she kept returning to was the room itself, the people in it. Clarence Mosby, in his brown suit, ironed the night before. Gloria Reyes holding her daughter's hand. Patricia Drummond with her eyes closed when Cross read the findings. The retired minister. The chess players. The neighbors from Calder Street who had stood outside her house in the evenings, not as protesters, not as activists, but simply as people who wanted to be counted present. She had not asked any of them to come. She had not sent out a call or organized a gathering or told anyone that their presence would matter. They had come anyway. Because that is what communities do when someone inside them is hurt, and the hurt is allowed to be public. They gather, not always with words, not always with action, sometimes just with bodies, with the simple physical fact of being there, of choosing proximity over the easier distance of looking away. Dorothy had spent 50 years of her adult life watching people choose the easier distance. She knew how to live in a world that mostly looked away. She had developed, over those 50 years, a practice of not expecting. Not because she was bitter. She was not bitter. Bitterness was a waste of energy she needed for other things. But because the gap between what ought to happen and what actually happens in the experience of a black woman of her generation in a southern city of this particular character had been wide enough and consistent enough that she had learned not to lean on the far side of it. You walked your own path. You kept your own counsel. You carried what you needed to carry, and you did not spend your mornings grieving the help that never came. But sitting in that chamber at 9 in the morning, feeling the specific heat of 60-plus bodies gathered on her behalf, hearing the particular quality of silence that settles over a room, when everyone in it is paying absolute attention, Dorothy felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt held, not in a sentimental way, not in the way the word gets used in greeting cards, in the physical, literal, bone-deep way that you feel it when a room full of people decide without being asked to be on your side. She sat with that feeling through the whole proceeding, It kept her straight in her chair. It kept her hands steady on the cloth bag. It kept her voice level when she spoke. Clarence Mosby had driven himself to the hearing. He had a 2009 Buick LeSabre that he kept in meticulous condition, partly because he was a meticulous man, and partly because the car had been a retirement gift from his colleagues at the Postal Service, and he treated gifts with the respect you give things that were given in love. He had parked 2 blocks from City Hall because the lot was already full by 8:45. He walked the 2 blocks. He was 68 years old, and his knees had been giving him trouble since a fall on an icy walkway 3 winters ago, and he walked with a slight hitch on the right side. But he walked. He had thought about this hearing for days. He had turned it over at night, lying awake in the bedroom of the house he had lived in alone since his wife passed 4 years ago, staring at the ceiling and working through what it meant that he was going to do this. He had not talked about the 2021 incident since the complaint was closed. He had told his daughter about it once carefully, and she had been angry on his behalf, and then worried for him, and then told him to stay out of that park. Just stay out of it, Daddy, it's not worth it. He had not stayed out of it. He loved that park. He had walked it every morning for 23 years longer than Dorothy had, longer than anyone he knew. He had simply started going earlier before Pruitt's shift began. This was the accommodation he had made. Adjust your schedule around the man who had taken something from you, because the system had decided that what he took was not worth retrieving. Mosby had made that accommodation for 3 years, and then he had seen the news coverage, and then he had heard the name, and then he had sat in his living room and thought, this woman is 74 years old and blind, and she walked home from that park without her cane and she is standing up. And what am I doing? He made the call. He sat in that hearing room, and when Webb's evidence package was presented and his own complaint appeared on the projected summary described in 1 line with the closure date stamped beside it, he felt the specific complicated emotion of a person who has spent 3 years wondering if they imagine the weight of something and who has just had the weight confirmed. It had been real. It had always been real. And it was finally on record. He did not speak at the hearing. He had offered to testify, and Webb had told him his account was already in the evidentiary file, and would be cited directly that his presence in the room was itself a form of a testimony. He understood that. Presence is testimony. The willingness to be counted, to be visible, to sit in a room where the man who hurt you is also sitting is a form of evidence that no attorney can fabricate and no institution can dismiss. When Cross read the findings and the vote was announced, Mosby pressed his mouth flat and looked at the ceiling, not to hold back tears. He was past that. He looked up because in certain traditions you look up when something good happens. You look toward whatever is above you. You acknowledge that you did not get here alone. He sat for another 20 minutes after the gavel fell. Let the room empty around him. Then he stood, straightened his suit jacket, and walked back to his Buick. He drove to Riverside Park. He sat in the car in the parking lot for a while. Then he got out, walked down to the path, and took his morning walk. The one he had been taking earlier to avoid Pruitt for 3 years. He walked it at the right time. His time. The DOJ pattern or practice report when it was released 4 months after the hearing was 47 pages long. It had been compiled by Agent Webb and a team of 3 DOJ investigators who had spent those 4 months conducting interviews, reviewing records, analyzing patrol data, and building the kind of documented case that, once it exists, cannot be unmade. 43 unjustified stops in Riverside Park over 5 years. 38 involving Black or Latino residents over the age of 55. The report noted that in 0 of the 43 cases had the officer making the stop filed paperwork noting a lawful basis for the detention. In 21 of the cases, no incident report of any kind had been filed. It noted that the internal complaint review process within the Harlan's Creek Police Department had, in the preceding 6 years, dismissed 100% of complaints against officers who were members of the Patrolmen's Brotherhood, without referring a single case for independent review. 100%, not a single case, in 6 years. The report did not describe this as corruption. It described it using the language of civil rights law, which is more precise and for that reason more damning. It described a failure of oversight, a culture of non-accountability, a structure in which officers were insulated from consequences not by any single malicious decision, but by a series of small procedural choices that taken together had the same effect as deliberate protection. The report recommended a federal consent decree. Mandatory body cameras footage submitted for independent review within 72 hours. All civilian complaints reviewed by a third party before being assessed internally. Random audits of patrol patterns by demographic data. Annual reporting to the DOJ on complaint resolution outcomes. Mandatory training on use of force and civilian rights conducted by instructors with no affiliation to the Brotherhood. The city of Harlan's Creek accepted the consent decree. It was signed in a ceremony that nobody made a big production of, which was probably appropriate. Consent decrees are not victories. They are the formal acknowledgement of a failure and the beginning of an attempt to correct it. Victories come later if they come in the form of mornings that go the way mornings are supposed to go. Chief Norman Barr had already resigned by the time the decree was signed. His successor was a woman named Captain Andrea Hollins, who had come up through the Atlanta PD and who had a reputation for taking civilian complaints seriously enough that she had twice in her career personally initiated internal reviews that had resulted in officers being suspended. She was not perfect. No chief is perfect. But she was a different kind of beginning. Marcus finished his temporary Atlanta assignment 9 months after the hearing. He went back to Washington. He took on a new case the week he returned. A different city, a different officer, the same structure. The same architecture of impunity built over time through small decisions that added up to something enormous. He worked the case the way he worked all of them. Methodically. With patience. With the understanding which 11 years had taught him that these cases are not resolved in dramatic moments. They are resolved in hours at a desk in carefully worded filings and the slow accumulation of documented fact. The dramatic moment comes later, if you do the desk work. He called Dorothy every Sunday, without fail, from wherever he was, sometimes from the office, sometimes from a hotel room in a city he was visiting for a deposition. Sometimes from the parking lot of a courthouse where something had gone well and he needed a moment before going back in. She always picked up on the second ring. She told him about her walks, about the park, about what the weather was doing, about the chess players who had come back and who were there most mornings now and who had, once when she passed, called out to her by name and told her good morning with an enthusiasm that made her laugh. She told him the new cane was breaking in well, getting the right weight in her hand, starting to feel like hers. She told him about the small things, the ordinary good things, the mornings that were just mornings, and he listened the way you listen to things that matter most, which is carefully and without interrupting, and with the full knowledge that ordinary mornings are not actually ordinary at all. They are the whole point. They are what all of it is for. There's a bench in Riverside Park now at the south end of the path, near the place where the old water oak stands. It is a plain wooden bench, the same as the others. But on the back of it there is a small engraved plate. Plain metal mounted flush to the wood. It does not say anything grand. It does not announce itself. It says, for every step taken in the right direction, for every voice that refused to be silent. Riverside Park, Harlan's Creek, Georgia. If you know the story, you know what it means. If you are just a jogger passing through, or a parent watching your children at the fountain, or an old man arriving early with a newspaper, you might sit on that bench without knowing anything about it at all. And that is fine too. That is fine too. Because the bench was not put there to tell the story. The bench was put there so the story could rest for a while, so that the morning could go on, so that the park could be what a park is supposed to be. A place where ordinary people walk in the early light without having to think about whether they are permitted to be there. A place where a 74-year-old woman can take her morning walk and feel the familiar path under her feet, and hear the birds in the water oak, and tap her cane against the ground once at a specific spot in acknowledgement of something that happened and was answered. And keep going, keep going. That is what she taught him. That is what he carried into every courtroom he ever entered. Not the anger, not the righteous fury, though he felt it, not the grief, the forward motion, one foot, then the other, no matter what the morning brings, because that is how you survive it, and that is how you change it. And in the end, those two things are not as different as they seem. Patricia Drummond had been a school teacher for 31 years. She taught 8th grade English at Carver Middle School, which sat 6 blocks from Riverside Park on the north side of Harlan's Creek. She had taught there since she was 28 years old. She had taught the children of people she had grown up with. She had taught children who came to her class unable to read a full paragraph, and left it reading whole chapters aloud with something that looked unmistakably like pleasure. She was 59 years old, and she loved her work in the specific, durable way that people love things they have committed to through difficulty. She had not until 6 months before the hearing encountered Dale Pruitt in any direct way. She knew the name. You knew the name if you had lived on the south side of Harlan's Creek long enough and paid attention. The way you know the names of certain recurring problems. The way those names get passed quietly like warnings through the informal networks of a community trying to protect itself from things the official systems will not address. She had adjusted her routes accordingly, taken the long way home from the grocery store, parked on different streets, moved through the parts of the neighborhood she loved with the low-grade wariness of someone who has learned without being told explicitly where the tripwires are. That had been working. Until the evening, she drove home a different way because there was a construction on her usual street, and Pruitt's cruiser had pulled up behind her 2 blocks from her own house. She had not been speeding. She had not been texting. She had not rolled through a stop or crossed a line. She had been driving home. Black woman, nice car, unfamiliar street. 6 in the evening. He had told her to get out of the vehicle. She had asked why. He had said he was asking the questions. He had asked what she was doing in this neighborhood. She had told him she lived here. He had said, prove it. She had her ID. She had shown it to him. He had studied it longer than necessary and handed it back and said, that's a Calder Street address. What are you doing over here? She had explained in the flat, careful voice she used when she was managing a situation that was already past the point of being reasonable that she had taken a detour because of construction on her regular route. He had asked her if she had anything in the car he should know about. She had said no. He had asked if she minded if he took a look. She had said, I do mind. I have not given you any lawful reason to search this vehicle. She knew the law. She taught her students about the law. She taught them about their rights because she had seen in 31 years in this city what happened to people who did not know them. He had told her he was going to need her to step out of the vehicle. That was when she had called her school. On speaker. right there with him standing beside the car. She had called the main office line and asked her colleague to confirm out loud for anyone listening that Patricia Drummond was a teacher at Carver Middle School, that she lived at the address on her ID, and that she was on her way home. Her colleague had done this without hesitation. Had added, "Is everything okay, Patricia?" She had said, "I'll call you back in a few minutes." Pruitt had told her she was free to go. She had driven the remaining 2 blocks to her house. She had sat in the driveway for 12 minutes. Then she had gone inside and sat at her kitchen table and written the whole thing down, every detail, in a spiral notebook she kept for exactly this purpose. She had not filed a complaint. She had sat with the notebook and thought about the 9 complaints she had heard about over the years that had disappeared into the department's internal process and come out as nothing. And she had thought about the specific vulnerability of her position, a black woman, a teacher, visible in the community, and the ways in which being visible while black can make you a target for the next time and the time after that. And she had decided not to file. She had not felt good about that decision. She had not felt safe about it either. She had just made it the way you make certain decisions when the options in front of you are not actually options, just different shapes of the same unavoidable situation. When she heard about Dorothy, she had felt something crack open in her chest. Not because the situations were identical, they were not, but because the structure was the same officer, the same park, the same neighborhood, the same calculation on his part that these were people he could reach for without consequence. She had sent the email. She had given her statement to Webb. She had come to the hearing. And when Cross read the findings when the vote was announced, Patricia Drummond had closed her eyes for a moment and thought about the 31 years of students she had taught to know their rights, about how she hoped none of them had ever needed to use that knowledge the way she had, about how she intended to keep teaching it anyway, about how the lesson was not just know the law. The lesson was the law is a tool, and tools only work if people are willing to pick them up. She opened her eyes. She was already planning the unit she would teach in the spring. She was going to call it What Happens When Someone Says No. The week after the hearing, a group of people from Dorothy's church organized themselves without anyone officially organizing them. There was no meeting, no email chain, no formal announcement. Someone mentioned to someone else that it would be meaningful if the community could do something to mark what had happened. Not a celebration, because a celebration felt wrong when what had started it was something cruel, but a marking, an acknowledgement. A woodworker in the congregation, a man named Samuel, who had been making furniture in a workshop behind his house for 40 years, heard about this through his wife, who had heard it from the woman she sat beside in the choir. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he went into his workshop. He spent a week on the bench. He chose Goodwood Careful Joinery, the kind of construction that would last through Georgia winters and Georgia summers and all the years in between. He sanded it smooth and finished it with an oil that would protect the grain. He brought it to the park on a Saturday morning. The deacons helped him carry it. They set it at the south end of the path near the water oak. A member of the congregation who worked in metal fabrication made the plate. Engraved it with the words they had agreed on, for every step taken in the right direction, for every voice that refused to be silent. Riverside Park, Harlan's Creek, Georgia. They set the plate on the bench on a Sunday afternoon with no ceremony. Dorothy was not there. They had not told her about it. They told her about it the following Tuesday when 3 of the women came to her house for tea. She listened. She asked what kind of wood. They told her it was oak. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said good. She said solid wood lasts, and she did not say anything else about it, But when she took her walk the following morning, she went a little further than usual to the south end of the path, and she found the bench by feel the particular height and curve of the back of it. She ran her fingers over the engraved plate, slowly, reading with her hands. She stood there for a while. Then she walked back. In the months that followed the hearing, Harlan's Creek changed in ways that were both large and small. The large ones were documented: the consent decree, the body camera mandate, the new complaint review process, the resignation of the chief, the suspension of 3 officers whose own records were being reviewed as part of the broader investigation. These were real. These mattered. But the small ones were harder to measure and in some ways more important. People began to use the park differently. Not dramatically differently. Not in any way that would show up in data. But the elderly man, who had been taking his morning walk at 5:30 to avoid the early shift, changed it back to 7. He went at 7 now, the time he preferred, the time when the light was good and the temperature was comfortable and the other morning walkers were out, and you could nod to someone you knew and feel like you were part of something. The 2 men who played chess at the fountain started coming back regularly. They had stopped for a while after the stories came out, after the discomfort of having the place they loved be associated with something that had happened there. But they came back. You cannot let one man's cruelty take a park from you. You take it back by showing up. Dorothy's morning walk became a kind of quiet touchstone in the neighborhood. People who knew her story and saw her on the path felt something. Not the kind of feeling that asks to be performed or expressed. The quieter kind. The kind you carry for the rest of the day and don't quite know what to do with except to hold it carefully and try to be a little better than you were before you felt it. The woman at the bakery on Calder, who had watched the whole incident from her window and had stood frozen behind the glass, had come to Dorothy's house 3 days after the hearing. She had knocked, and when Dorothy answered, she had said nothing for a moment. Then she had said, "I should have come out." Dorothy had said yes. The woman had said, "I know." They had stood there for a moment, the weight of that between them. Then Dorothy had said, "Are you coming out now?" And the woman had said yes. And that was enough. That was how it works when it works. Not in grand gestures, in the quiet reopening of things that were closed. There is one more thing worth telling. 3 weeks after Pruitt pleaded guilty and was sentenced, Marcus received a letter. It came to his office at the DOJ, addressed by hand in handwriting that looked like it belonged to a man who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was still taught as a serious discipline. It was from Clarence Mosby. It was short, 3 paragraphs. In the first, he thanked Marcus for his work on the case. In the second, he described the morning he had driven to Riverside Park after the hearing. The walk he had taken at the right time. The walk he had been taking in the early pre-dawn hours for 3 years to avoid Pruitt. The feeling of walking it at 7 in the morning in the light at his pace. He wrote, "I cannot adequately describe what it meant to walk that path when I wanted to walk it. You probably understand." In the third paragraph, he said something Marcus read twice. He wrote, "I am old enough to know that what your mother did was not easy. Filing that complaint, sitting in that room facing the person who hurt her in public with no guarantee of what would come next. I know that because I know what it cost me to decide not to do it." He wrote, "I want you to tell her that the chessboard is full most mornings now. Tuesdays, we get 4 players." The small things came back. Marcus folded the letter. He kept it in his desk drawer. Every few weeks he opened the drawer and saw it there. He had never shown it to Dorothy. He didn't think she needed to see it. He thought she already knew in the way she knew most things through the accumulated weight of evidence and the particular quality of the mornings she described to him every Sunday on the phone. She knew the park was different. She knew people were walking it the way they were supposed to walk it. She knew because she walked it herself. Every morning, 6:10, the same route. Past the bakery on Calder, across Monroe Bridge, through the south entrance of Riverside Park, past the bench with the plate, past the place where it happened. One tap of the cane, one acknowledgement, and forward, always forward. That is the only direction she has ever known. That is what Eugene's hands built into the hickory. That is what she put into the oak. That is what she gave her son across 46 years of mornings, the steady and unbreakable conviction that you keep walking. Not because the path is always safe, not because the morning always greets you the way it should, but because stopping is how you lose. And Dorothy Weston has never once lost. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, subscribe our channel and let these voices travel further than any single morning. The morning is still out there, and somewhere on a path in a Georgia park a woman is walking it. One step, and then the next. Some mornings she could hear the birds before she reached the bridge. A particular kind of songbird nested in the row of sweet gum trees along the eastern edge of the park, and they began before first light, before most of the neighborhood was awake. Dorothy had been listening to them for 19 years, and she still did not know the name of the bird. She had never asked. She liked not knowing. There was something about a sound you have lived with for nearly 2 decades that belongs to you in a way that naming it would diminish. It was hers, part of the specific texture of this specific morning. The birds and the bridge and the creak of the park gate and the particular softness of the gravel on the south path. These were hers. Dale Pruitt had tried to take this from her, not just the cane, not just the morning, the sense that this place was safe, that she had the right to be in it, that her presence on that path was as legitimate and as protected as anyone else's. He had tried to make her feel like a problem to be managed rather than a person who belonged. She had not let him. She had walked home that morning through everything he had taken from her. She had walked home without the cane and without assistance, and without the dignity of a single bystander choosing to speak. She had walked home and sat at her kitchen table and placed the broken pieces in a dish towel and waited for the shaking to stop. And then she had called her son, and then she had come back. That is the whole of it in the end. The coming back, not the hearing, though the hearing mattered. Not the verdict, though the verdict mattered. Not the criminal charges, or the consent decree, or the resignation of the chief, or the vote of the board. All of those things mattered. All of those things were real and important and hard-won. But underneath all of it, the ground of it, the thing it rested on, was this. A 74-year-old blind black woman who had walked a path for 19 years walked it again 6 weeks after someone tried to tell her she had no right to be there. That is how dignity survives. Not by waiting for permission, not by waiting for the system to confirm that you were right, not even by waiting for the verdict, by walking, by continuing to walk, by refusing to let the act of cruelty be the final word about the morning. The morning does not belong to the person who breaks things. It belongs to the person who gets up and goes out into it anyway. Dorothy Weston had always known this. She had known it since she was 15 years old on a march in Savannah. She had known it in the hospital when the doctors told her she would not see again. She had known it in the garage, watching Eugene's hands shape the hickory, hearing him work in the quiet satisfaction of a man who built things that lasted. She carried it forward. Every morning, 6:10, one step, then the next.